it was understood that there's many ways to achieve realization, many ways of understanding the divine, many languages for it, many symbols for it, many images of it. And they're all valid if they get you to the goal of realization.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the way we understand religion in the West, where they're in competition and one is said to be the true only way. And so Christian missionaries in India have always had difficulty getting people to accept only Jesus, because they say, wait a minute, it's just one form of the divine. And so Jesus in India is held up there along with Buddha and the great masters of Hinduism as either a great avatar, a direct incarnation, embodiment of the divine, of God in one form or another, like Krishna and Rama. Many would include Buddha, and many would include Jesus. And those who don't see Jesus as an incarnation of God, not the only incarnation, but one of many, they'll say at least he was a great spiritual master, a great yogi, a great spiritual teacher, and he should be honored, and he should be revered like Krishna is, and so forth. All the gurus are like that. Yogananda took it to another level, and he actually made the claim that Jesus is part of the lineage of Kriya Yoga.
Welcome to a Broaderlenspodcast. The opinions expressed on Broaderlenspodcast are those of the guest speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host or Broaderlenspodcast. Philip, welcome to Broaderlenspodcast. What an honor to have you on. I really mean that.
I appreciate that, Boo-Boo. It's good to be with you.
It's good to be with you. And maybe before we get started, you can share a little bit about who you are and the work that you do, if you don't mind, briefly.
I have been mostly a writer and author of books and a public speaker. I was trained as a meditation teacher, it seems like 200 years ago, and a spiritual counselor. So I've done all those things, but if I'm known, it's mostly because of my books and also my podcast, which is called Spirit Matters. And my spiritual journey, since that's what we're going to be talking about here, began in the late 1960s when I was young and seeking and searching and questioning everything, including my atheist upbringing and all the conventional wisdom of the time. And in that context, I was drawn to the spiritual traditions that were born in India that we came to know as Hinduism and Buddhism, more specifically Vedanta philosophy and yoga. And I was just captivated by all that, and it transformed my life. I took up meditation practice in 1968, and I've meditated every day since. And my personal journey and my professional life have come together in the form of writing a lot about the spiritual teachings of the East and how they came to the West and how they've been adapted to the Western lifestyle and form. So in that context, I published, you can see behind me, a book called American Veda, which covers that whole history, and then other works that integrate East and West. That seems to be, if I had to summarize, in one sentence, what my focus has been. It's this meeting of East and West, and helping to elucidate it for people.
Yeah, thank you. And you know what I love about those teachings is they didn't come to America or to the West through force.
Yeah, quite the opposite.
They came through
No, you're quite
attraction.
right. And none of the teachers who came here ever asked anybody to convert to anything. There was no coercion. No, it was more like introducing a scientific principle or technology. There were ideas, concepts, precepts, and they were presented as something you could think about. And no one asked you to believe in anything or to sign on the dotted line, or else you'd go to hell. Or it wasn't like that. But the important thing is the ideas were accompanied by methodologies. So the teachers were able to say, look, whether you're a Christian or a Jew or atheist or whatever, there's value in these teachings and the practices, mostly meditation and yogic practices that come along with it. So try it out. And if it works for you, you can adapt it to your own way of life. And it was that kind of thing, nothing by way of coercive. We could talk about the behavior of some gurus who came, which gets a little problematic. But it was nothing about converting or giving up your own religion or a lifestyle or anything like that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask you a question that you're often asked when you're doing an interview, but I feel it's an important question. What inspired you to write a biography of Paramahansa Yogananda when there was already an autobiography of a yogi, which has inspired millions of people? And before you answer that, I know Osho kind of was negative, had some negative words to say about autobiography of a yogi, which I don't think he obviously read it fully from what he says.
Well, let me just briefly say, Osho had a lot of negative things to say about most of the gurus who came here, because he was a rebellious kind of guy and an iconoclast. And, so he spoke poorly of a number of teachers I have a lot of respect for. So that's the way it is. But your question about why a biography of Yogananda, the question you asked me is the first question I asked myself when I had the idea. But it goes back to the book I mentioned earlier, American Veda. In researching what amounts to a couple of 100 years of history of how these teachings came to the West and influenced so many millions of people and so many prominent people. And it's a fascinating history. And in that context, I researched all the prominent gurus who came here, all the swamis and yoga masters and so forth. And, of course, Yogananda was one of the most important, certainly one of them, if not the most influential, one of the top 2 or 3. And I found in researching his life, or his story for that book, I got fascinated by his personal history. And we know a lot about his personal history because of Autobiography of a Yogi. And most gurus, they're monks for the most part. They don't write much about or speak much about their personal histories, but Yogananda did. So I devoted a chapter to him in American Veda. And afterward, after the book came out and I was thinking what to write next, I thought, well, maybe I was really fascinated with Yogananda's life, and I only had like 20 or so odd pages to devote to it. Maybe I could flesh it out and tell the whole story. But like you asked, I said, well, why do that? He's already written an autobiography. So I reread for the, I don't know, fourth or fifth time at that point, Autobiography of a Yogi, and I realized how much he left out. There's passages, there was one passage that I said, oh, wait a minute. And it was something like, and 4 years passed in Boston. And I thought, wait a minute. He came here at age 27 in the year 1920, the first year women were allowed to vote in America.
Yeah.
And he arrives in Boston, which in September, which is when he arrived, would be colder than Calcutta ever gets. And he was about to experience November and December and January. What was that like? And what did he do in those 4 years? How did it, what transpired? And then I realized there's a lot like that. There were past big chunks of his life after he came to America that are left out of the autobiography. And I said, okay, somebody's got to fill in those gaps. And so I set out to write the book. And what I wanted to do was capture not so much his teachings, which are widely available, but his personal human story. And so it was that kind of obsession that led to the book.
Yeah, I love that. Do you have any examples of people that he impacted that may be famous, that really touched his life from his book, The Autobiography of a Yogi?
Oh, sure. Most of the gurus who came here that had any sizable impact influenced important people, prominent people, philosophers, psychologists, scientists, artists. Yogananda was no exception. So at the time he was here, there were he dedicates Autobiography of a Yogi to Luther Burbank, the great horticulturist, botanist, who was very famous at the time. Orchestra conductors, opera stars, this is obviously pre-rock and roll days. So, but there were prominent people, prominent scientists and so forth who would speak out favorably for him and his teachings. After he passed, his autobiography came out in 1946. He passed in 1952. But the book just kept selling and selling and selling. I discovered it in 1970 myself. And it was, popular in the counterculture circles I traveled in as a young man. And I always joke that I still have the copy I read in 1970. And it cost $5 at that time. The price on the cover says $5. And I wouldn't have had $5 to spend on a hardcover book in 1970. I was a poor kid, I was a young man. And so I must have borrowed it and never returned it. So I always say I wrote about Yogananda to make up for the karma of ripping off somebody's copy of the book. But one of the most important people his book and teachings influence was George Harrison of the Beatles. Now, George was also deeply influenced by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in transcendental meditation, and deeply influenced by Srila Prabhupada, the founder of the Hare Krishna movement. George got around, but Autobiography of a Yogi is one of the first things he read that shifted his mind and his thinking about spirituality. And over the years, he would keep copies around and give gifts to people of the book. And when he was in Los Angeles, he would visit the Yogananda centers and so on. So he's probably the most famous person in that category, but also Steve Jobs. Now, these people obviously never met Yogananda, but Steve Jobs was influenced by the autobiography, and when he was dying, requested that at his memorial service, copies of the book would be given out to guests, and that's what happened. So those are two important figures in modern life.
Yeah, thank you. I know on page 5 in your book, you talk about Kriya, Kriya Yoga, and it shares the same root meaning as the word karma, which I thought that was interesting. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, Kriya essentially means an action. Karma means action. So they share a similar derivation from the Sanskrit. Kriya, more specifically, are actions. When you say Kriya Yoga, you mean actions taken to advance the state of yoga, the development of the state of consciousness we call yoga, of unity or oneness. And so in that category of Kriya Yoga, there's many, many methods. There are teachers who have nothing to do with Yogananda or his lineage who call what they teach Kriya Yoga. And it's different from the methods Yogananda uses. So it's just a generic term for actions, yogic methods. But in Yogananda's case, because of his fame, what he calls Kriya Yoga is what most people think of. They think it's what Yogananda teaches. It's just one form or several forms, different practices. His tradition, his lineage of teachers teaches these forms of Kriya Yoga. And they're meditative methods that I won't go into because they should be taught properly by authorized people.
Yeah, thank you. And I told you early on, before we started recording, that I had Yogananda appear in me, to me through spirit in so many different stories I have where I never heard of him, and I felt guided by him for my first few years of my awakening. And you used the term Upa Guru, which I never heard before, and I really appreciate that because he was my Upa Guru. But I would sit in self-realization fellowship, and I went to Ananda as well because Ananda was in Torrance, California, and I would drive up to Pacific Palisades on the weekends and spend a lot of time alone. And I went into the 12-step community, and I would take someone through what we call the third step at Lake Shrine. I'll do a third step with them at Lake Shrine. But I spent a lot of time at Lake Shrine. But I would sit there, and I would look at the lineup of the gurus, the masters, right? And for some reason, Yogananda's image, and was more brighter. It was more alive for me, and I think that was one of his ways of showing me he's present with me for some weird divine reason, right? But I would love for you to touch on the Kriya Yoga lineage a little bit about Babaji, Lahiri Mahashaya, and Swami Sri Yukteswar, if you don't mind, briefly, and then we can walk into his early life, if you don't mind, Yogananda's. And I love how you wrote the boy Mukunda in your book, and so you can walk us into that.
That was his name, Mukunda.
Yeah.
Well, let's take the gurus in reverse. Yogananda's guru, his principal guru, Sadguru, as they say, was Sri Yukteswar. Sri Yukteswar, whom Yogananda met sort of the summer after he graduated from high school, and became his guru until Yukteswar's passing in 1935 or 6. He was in the lineage that Yogananda has made famous, and who you see on the altars as you at any facility that teaches in that name of that lineage. Sri Yukteswar's guru was Lahiri Mahasya, who lived primarily in what was then called Benares, which is where Yogananda met Sri Yukteswar. And what's interesting about that is Lahiri Mahasya was a householder. He was not a monk, not a renunciate. He had a family in Benares. And that's, in these lineages, the ones that we're most familiar with are renunciate orders. Sri Yukteswar was a Swami, but prior to that, he had been a householder. He had been a family man. After his wife died, he took renunciate vows and became a Swami. So there's Yogananda, on the other hand, never had a family. He took monastic vows as a young man. But the reason I'm emphasizing that is because Yogananda's guru had a householder life and was a property owner and all that. And his guru, Lahiri Mahasya, was a householder. And at the same time, a very powerful and effective teachers, spiritual teachers and guides who had many, many followers. That is important because there are many people who are drawn to the teachings of the East, but when they encounter teachings that have a monastic emphasis on renouncing the world, it's a turnoff. That they don't want to go there. So the fact that Yogananda's guru and the guru's guru were householders had a favorable impact on many people who were drawn to Yogananda's teachings, because it was emphasized that you could be in the world and have a family and have a career and all that and still have a strong and deep spiritual life. To round off the lineage, Lahiri Mahasya's guru was and I'll say legendary in the best sense of the word, the legendary figure, a yogi called Babaji, who, according to Yogananda and other people who have allegedly, encountered Babaji in the flesh, is what Yogananda called him the ageless master. And he's said to be hundreds of years old and to be this, great master living in the Himalayas in a body that hasn't aged, has a youthful appearance, and who appears from time to time to people. Now, it should be said, because this sounds a little unbelievable, that, if you trust Yogananda's word and Lahiri Mahasya's and Sri Yukteswar's, they say that Babaji appeared to Lahiri Mahasya and anointed him, the person, to revive that form of Kriya Yoga for the modern world and for all people, not just renunciates. That would have occurred in the early part of the 20th century, or later part of the 19th century, I guess. And as it turns out, Lahiri Mahasya was Yogananda's parents' guru. And he grew up with photographs of, the one photograph of Lahiri Mahasya, and it had great meaning to him. And when he met Sri Yukteswar, he said, "Oh, this is my guru. He's had visions of him and so forth, and had met a lot of different gurus and swamis, but said, no, they're not my guru." And then he met Sri Yukteswar, and that's my guru. And it turned out that he had been a disciple of Lahiri Mahasya, just as Yogananda's parents were. And so, it all came together that way for him. And it should be said, and I have to say this because I write books and I have to be objective, that there are many people who claim to have met Babaji. There are people in India who say they met Babaji and Babaji anointed them to be a teacher and all this. And who knows? I mean, some of them, maybe they're deluded, maybe they're lying, or maybe it really happened. I can't say. All I know is the one person I met who claimed to be Babaji was obviously lying. So, but, whether you consider Babaji a legend or really as Yogananda and others describe him is up to you.
Can I ask you a question about his parents who were disciples of Lahiri Mahasaya?
Mm-hmm.
Supposedly, like, he predicted the pregnancy. Was that true? And he said through his body, many will receive the spiritual enlightenment of India. Was that true? Because that kind of aligns with the story of the Buddha and Jesus and so on.
Yeah, I have to remember my own book. The predicting the pregnancy I'm vague on that, but it's very clear that after the baby, Mukunda Lal Ghosh was his name, was born to Mr. and Mrs. Ghosh, they went to Benares to have Lahiri Mahasya bless the baby. And Lahiri did say that he had some destiny to be a world teacher, to be part of that lineage and so forth. And it was known. And according to Yogananda, Lahiri told Sri Yukteswar that among his disciples would be one who was destined to go to America and bring these teachings to the West. And Sri Yukteswar said to have recognized that Yogananda would be that person.
Wow. Wasn't he afraid of the word guru because it took on a lot of responsibility?
Sure. And it does. He took on a lot of responsibility as a very young man. He after becoming after graduating from college, what is the thing about Yogananda's life, that you could just talk about Yogananda, the great teacher, and what he had to say and how the methods he taught and the ideas and everything. But when you look at the human story, that's, to me, where the great lessons are and where it makes it so interesting. He was not a good student. He couldn't be bothered with schoolwork. He was just dead-eye, zeroed in on becoming spiritually enlightened and learning as much as he could. So even as a young man, even as a 14, 15-year-old, he would be going to meet gurus and going to temples and going to meet swamis and anything he could, and reading sacred texts instead of school books and stuff. He was a young man too. He loved sports. He ran races. He was apparently a good athlete. But it was, spiritual teachings were what he had his mind on. So when he finished high school, he had no interest in going to college or anything. He went to Benares to live in an ashram, and then met Sri Yukteswar and said, I just want to be your disciple. And Sri Yukteswar said, no, go to college. And, so and people like me, that was a really interesting thing to learn, because many, many people, at least in my generation, had gurus or Buddhist masters and so forth. And in many cases, they said, no, go get married, have children, go get a graduate degree. And you say, I just want God. I don't want that stuff. But they were like, like good parents. They often did that. And Sri Yukteswar said, no, you're going to college. And he did, and he stuck it out. But after he graduated, he, after meeting Sri Yukteswar, Sri Yukteswar put him through some paces before he finally said, okay, you can be, I'll initiate you into this order of swamis, and you can take monastic vows. And he did. And the family, Yogananda had a family, and the father was very disappointed about that, because he wanted grandchildren. He wanted Yogananda to have a nice job in the world. And it was like the kind of thing that so many of us go through with parents and authority figures. So Yogananda was a rebellious young man, but he also did what he was told when it came from the right source.
Him and Yukteswar, didn't they help establish life schools? I thought that was beautiful.
Yeah. Interesting, because he had no interest in school himself. He was very critical of schools, but he valued education. But he had his own ideas about what a young person's education should be like. And so he started schools even before he graduated college himself. And the first thing he did as a monastic was run a school, start a school, and it still exists in India. And then when he came here, education was a big part of what he was about. So he was a critic of the typical education system in India, which was very British, because it was part of the British Empire. And he, was kind of way ahead of his time in incorporating spiritual principles and practices into the educational system that he, developed. So that was part of it. And of course, you could say his whole life was, he was an educator in a certain way.
And you were a part of his movie, though, Awaken. I've seen you were in that. In the beginning of that, it shows like a pre-birth memory. Is that pretty accurate? He had like pre-birth memories in his mother's womb.
Oh, I thought you meant I had a pre-birth memory. No. Yeah, I'm on screen in the movie Awake for, here and there. I didn't have anything to do with the production of it. I just, so people know, the producers and directors that get all the credit. I just,
part of it,
just came on and talked like I am here, and they used some of the footage. But yes, it opens with that, and I mention it in my biography of him. He says that he remembers being in the womb. That's an early memory. That's pretty rare, but he says he does remember that, and then being born.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
How did he get to the West? I'd love for you to touch on that and walk us into his human experience and getting into the West, coming to America.
The story of how it came about, there's all these, what people would say are coincidences, but, he would say it was all divinely planned. I won't go into all those details, but it was a lot of fun to write about, and you can read about it in my book, my biography of him. But he knew he would one day come to America. It was just part of his destiny, and gurus would talk about it. He didn't know when or how. And during World War I, of course, that wasn't going to happen. But a year or so after the war ended, he one day had a vision while he was at the school that he started. And he said, I'm going to leave today and I'm going to go to Calcutta, which is where his home was and his family was. And I'm going to see about going to America. I had this vision. And circumstances somehow worked out. There was going to be, in 1920 in Boston, September, the resumption of an annual Congress of Religious Liberals, it was called, or something like that. It was an annual thing that was put on by the Unitarians, and they had suspended them for the few years of World War I. So this was going to be the first post-war Congress. It was going to be in Boston. And Yogananda didn't know about it, but when he said he wanted to go to America by a series of events, he ended up replacing a scheduled speaker, the one representative from India that was to come to this Congress, who was a well-known educator in Calcutta. Yogananda was his replacement because he couldn't go. And he was only 27. But he got on, it was to replace this educator. But then he couldn't get on the boat because there was the first boat to go from India to America, passenger ship, since the war, and it was all booked. But then there was a cancellation, and his father gave him the money, and all this stuff happened, and he ended up on the boat. And, came to America and landed in Boston in September of 1920 and rode the subway to the YMCA, which I just walked past, still there in Boston just last month, and spoke at this Congress. And afterward, somebody invited him to speak at a church in Somerville outside of Cambridge, and one thing led to another. And he stayed pretty much for the next 32 years, except for one trip back to India.
That's amazing. What are some of the things through your research that shocked you that you never knew of going into the research?
One of the things that interested me most is, and it turns out, because I wrote about it, of course, in my biography of him, and it's the thing that most people mention when they tell me what they've learned from my book, which is it wasn't easy, everything he did. He had struggles. He had setbacks. He had difficulties. Don't forget, he came here, a stranger in a strange land, it was the height of racism in America. The Ku Klux Klan was having a big resurgence in 1920. People from Asia could not become citizens. There was a lot of anti-immigrant feeling and a lot of course, racism. And he was a dark-skinned guy wearing, strange clothing and with long hair. This was not easy. And then once he started teaching and he gathered interest and he gathered followers and so forth, he had to deal with, money and office space and employees and, all the things that go along with building an organization. And that's, he wasn't trained in that. He was a monk from a foreign culture. And these things are not easy under any circumstances. You throw in Christian nationalist feelings. He was a heathen. He was bringing this foreign religion, the devil's work, in people's mind. He was dark-skinned. He was from this culture that most people thought of as some primitive backwater of the British Empire. And he was a British subject. So the Brits were spying on him because, the independence movement was going on in India, and Yogananda was, a fan of Gandhi and his work. So, and he came in 1920, built his organization, his teaching, and then boom, the Depression came. So all through the years of the Depression, they could barely pay the bills. So he had a lot of financial pressure, and, managing imperfect human beings who worked for him or volunteered for him. He had people filing lawsuits against him. He had lurid headlines in newspapers. He had to deal with all kinds of stuff. And there were times when he said, I've had enough of this. I'm going back to India. I just want to live the life of a simple monk, which is what he had originally thought he would do. But he had been given this mission, and so he stuck it out. And we are all the beneficiaries of that. But to me, that was terribly important to see that even this highly evolved person, when he encountered real life stuff, he had challenges, he had difficulties, he had things to overcome. And I've had people say, I got on my spiritual path and I thought everything would be nice and easy, and I still have difficulties sometimes. But knowing that even Yogananda did has made it easier for me to deal with my stuff. And I found that to be very inspiring.
Yeah, I love that. And I love to hear the humanness in him, because it's easy for us to put up this picture of this divine spiritual master, God in human form. And we hear that with Jesus and Buddha and all these other beings over the years. And we put up this image of them, and we're incapable of touching that image when they're telling us, they're just like us. But so I love to hear the different, struggles and the humanness in them as well. Like you said, Matthew Fox, I had him on recently, and he talked about Thich Nhat Hanh, how he experienced. Thich Nhat Hanh was deeply hurt by the Vatican because they labeled him the Antichrist. And I just love to hear these stories of them being human.
Yeah. Well, not to mention, Thich Nhat Hanh came to the West because of the war in his home country of Vietnam. So he experienced, some very harsh realities.
Yeah, you're right. Guns being put to his head. He talks about that, or why they were burning themselves to get the attention for help. It's amazing. How did Yogananda deal with racism?
Well, he did. He had to, and there was a famous story I write about in the book where he was essentially told to leave Miami. Don't forget, at that time in the 20s, Miami was essentially deep South.
Yeah.
It was a vacation land and all that, but it was, it was the deep South. And don't forget, a lot of the gurus who came here, Yogananda's illustrious predecessor, Swami Vivekananda,
Yes,
he encountered all this stuff too. And then Yogananda came along, and Yogananda traveled to, certain parts of the country where, dark-skinned people are not very welcome. But what's interesting is especially the early gurus, and even now, there's a big proportion of the people who would attend and take classes and, learn Kriya Yoga methods and all that were women. Because, men were busy and men were cynical about such things. and women were drawn. So there were female devotees, and that made white husbands and brothers and fathers very suspicious. And so there was hostility. And he was essentially told by the Miami police, look, we can't protect you. If you want, if you value your well-being, you better get out of town because they're going to come after you. And so this happened. He had threats and all that. He had to deal with it. And one of the things he did is interesting. I mean, obviously couldn't change his skin color, but to make himself a little less conspicuous, he took the advice of people he met on the ship on the way to America and shaved his beard. So Yogananda was clean shaven throughout his whole time after he arrived in America. And most swamis have beards, but he was clean shaven. He would not cut his hair because he felt that would be to betray his vow, but he would tuck it in. When he was out in public, he would wear a hat like a fedora or put it, tuck it in this collar. And he would wear Western clothing. When he taught in traditional Swami clothing and would let his hair out. But out in public, you see him in business suits and fedora hat with, essentially what looks like his hair combed back. So he made concessions not to draw too much attention when he was out in public because he knew the consequences of that. And, as a well-spoken Indian who, knew the language well and all that, he faced a lot of religious bias and racism, but he was still not African American. And so he didn't experience it on the same level that an African American in certain parts of the country would have. But, he endured.
I took a religious class a few years back, and I told the professor that I feel like the Swamis of India know who Jesus is better than most pastors, and it kind of upset him, right? But when I first got into the teachings of Yogananda, he really shared on Jesus like I never heard before, and at a deeper level, it seemed like he understood the teachings. And he really shared in a way where Hindus and Christians, both of their traditions, could kind of hear the teachings. What is an avatar, and how did Yogananda look at Jesus?
Yogananda, let me back up a little bit. One of the interesting things about the Indian systems, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, they're in the category of what religious scholars would call the perennial philosophy, where it is understood that there is one reality, and the realization of our own inner divinity and our union with the ultimate. No one tradition owns that. They know that. Hinduism itself, Buddhism itself, they're very diverse. People don't realize that they take a, comparative religion course, and it all seems very, simple. But they're very diverse. And so right from the beginning of those traditions, it was understood that there's many ways to achieve realization, many ways of understanding the divine, many languages for it, many symbols for it, many images of it. And they're all valid if they get you to the goal of realization.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the way we understand religion in the West, where they're in competition and one is set to be the true only way. And so Christian missionaries in India have always had difficulty getting people to accept only Jesus, because they say, wait a minute, it's just one form of the divine. And so Jesus in India is held up there along with Buddha and the great masters of Hinduism as either a great avatar, a direct incarnation, embodiment of the divine, of God in one form or another, like Krishna and Rama. Many would include Buddha, and many would include Jesus. And those who don't see Jesus as an incarnation of God, not the only incarnation, but one of many, they'll say at least he was a great spiritual master, a great yogi, a great spiritual teacher, and he should be honored and he should be revered like Krishna is, and so forth. All the gurus are like that. Yogananda took it to another level, and he actually made the claim that Jesus is part of the lineage of Kriya Yoga, that Jesus, the disembodied Christ, is in cahoots with Babaji in guiding the lineage that came to be, that was brought here by Yogananda. That's a step that most gurus didn't take. But Yogananda was serious about that. And people would criticize him, say, oh, he's just selling out to the Christians, by saying all that. But there's every indication is that he really meant it. And he was a great student of Christ, as was Sri Yukteswar. Sri Yukteswar was something of a Bible scholar as well as an expert in his own traditions. And so Yogananda's take on who Jesus was and what he thinks as is the original teachings of Christ, just, he would distinguish between what he calls churchianity and the true teachings of Christ, which of course most Christians would say is blasphemy and is all that. But he has a different take, and that take, if you look at it, he's writing about Jesus as if, in the same way one might write about the life of Krishna or the life of Rama as this great incarnation of the divine that happened to come to, the Middle East instead of India, and had these teachings. And so his interpretation of the Beatitudes and, the other teachings of Christ is on a different level than what you'll hear in church on Sunday morning, as was other swamis and Indian scholars who wrote about Jesus. Yogananda did it in great length and great depth.
You're right. And you mentioned earlier he passed away in 1952. The Gospel of Thomas was found in 1945. And he felt that his mission was to come to the West to turn back the light, the original teachings of Jesus. And what I heard, and I know he didn't have any, they didn't translate. I don't know when they translated, but he didn't get his hands on the Gospel of Thomas. And I think what I hear is self-realization in the Gospel of Thomas. If you don't find the kingdom of heaven within you, then you are that poverty. Blessed is he who comes into being before he comes into being. Like, whoa, so I felt like that confirmed a lot of what Yogananda was saying, that was found in 1945, untouched by man, in the Gospel of Thomas and the Nag Hammadi Library.
And there's a lot of evidence that people from the Middle East had spent time in India, that people from what we call ancient Greece there was more of an exchange than we realized. And what you probably experienced yourself, I mean, I've interviewed hundreds of people, and a lot of people who came to Yogananda's teachings, as well as other gurus, but especially Yogananda with respect to Jesus, they may have been raised in a church and rejected it as young people, as for a variety of reasons. And they go and do their spiritual seeking, and they find a teacher like Yogananda or Swami, whoever, and they learn something different about Jesus than what they grew up with. And they come back to their own Christianity, but with new eyes, with a different way of understanding Jesus. But they come back. And similarly, many Jews who grew up feeling threatened by Christians, they'll read Yogananda or somebody else, and they'll say, "Oh, wait a minute. There's something here that's different from what my impression was." That happened to me. I was raised, as I said, by atheist Jews. They didn't have any interest. I had no religious training whatsoever. But when I was on my spiritual search, I came across Swamis and Buddhists writing about Jesus. And I said, what's going on here? And then I read the autobiography. And I said, man, this guy really likes Jesus. So I read the New Testament for the first time. I had already read the Upanishads. I had already read the Bhagavad Gita. And so now I was reading the New Testament, reading, the Gospels, and I come to the Sermon on the Mount and everything, and I say, oh, I get it. He was a guru. He had disciples. He was teaching these, methods of becoming one with the divine and all that, just like in the Upanishads. So I didn't have as much to unlearn as somebody like who grew up in Sunday school. But that change of perspective is not uncommon with people who, pick up teachings from Yogananda and other swamis. You come to see all of religious teachings in a different way.
Yeah, just learning how to read after my awakening, trying to read the second coming of Christ was pretty difficult. It was a challenge, but as the years went by and I started to expand my own consciousness, all of it started to make sense with me. I got to meet Swami Kriyananda, and he had a huge impact on me. The Revelations of Christ. I shared that with Neil Donald Walsh, some stories. And Sri Dayamata was another huge one. Her writings, Finding the Joy Within. I forget the other disciple, her friend, who was one of the last ones that was still alive and passed away.
Merlini Mata?
It started with the B, I think. She was one of the ones with Sri Dayamata. She was the other one typing while Yogananda's talking.
Yeah, I'm bad with names.
Yeah, I forget her name for some reason, but I got to see her before she passed. And
nice.
Yeah, just very very impactful. And I loved the parallels used to bridge the gap between the East and the West spiritual traditions. And then I use this one often in the book of John. He that dwelleth in love dwelleth in God. And that's beautiful, right? Or Krishna would say, I look upon all creatures equally. None are more dear, none are less dear. But those who worship me in love come to life in me, and I come to life in them. And when I started to hear the parallels, the universal consciousness, it all came to me early on. And it was just so beautifully put together where I heard the message.
Well, you're blessed, boo-boo.
Yeah, really grateful. I'd love for you to really quick to touch on the death of Yogananda. We hear rumors, and on Lake Shrine, there's the article of the LA Times sharing how his body didn't decay. Was that true? And I'd love to share for you to share the story of that was it a poem of India that he read before he passed away? Could you touch on that for us?
Let's start with that because it's more uplifting. It's fascinating. I have to say, I wrote my biography of Yogananda. I wrote it chronologically, so I go through his life. So his death and everything leading up to it is, toward the end of the book. And researching that period and writing about that day and that night, it was the most moving part of my research to me, because there was a lot of tender beauty in the whole thing. But one of the fascinating things was he loved his homeland. He loved India. And it pained him at times that he only got to go back for a year in that last 32 years of his life after he came here. He kept planning to go back again, and it never happened. But India, was in his blood, in his, veins. And so he would write about it and talk about it. And he said, I will die with India on my lips. And that's what happened. He had written a poem, long, beautiful poem called, what was it? Oh, God, I'm blanking on the title.
Something
It's about
India.
India. It's an homage to his homeland. It's a lengthy poem. So in 1952, when India had been an independent country now for almost 5 years, the newly appointed ambassador to the U.S. from India was visiting Los Angeles. And as a important Indian resident from India, by then he was a citizen. He finally could become a citizen in the last 3 years or 3 years of his life. But he was a prominent person of Indian descent in Los Angeles. And so they were part of the reception for the ambassador and his wife. And there was to be a big banquet, coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, at the Biltmore Hotel, which is where he first stayed when he came to India, to LA in 1925. And so there was to be this big banquet, and Yogananda was to give a keynote address. And the story says that he gathered his devotees in a room at the hotel before the festivities began, and people who were present said there was something different, something tender, and they knew something was, he'd been ailing, and he knew he wouldn't live a long life. And that night, at the banquet, he gave a keynote, and as part of his address, or the bulk of it, he read from that poem. And when he completed the poem about India, his love for India, he collapsed with a heart attack and died. So he literally died with India on his lips. Now, you asked about the state of the body. Now, legend has it that Yogananda, after he passed, the body didn't decay. And there's a statement from the coroner to that effect. It's kind of been debunked, and it's hard to know what the truth is, because he was embalmed, and so it would not have been, according to some people, not have been that unusual for the body to stay preserved. There were some signs of, or it was already starting to decay when he was put into the enclosed coffin and so forth. So for a few days, that seemed to be the truth. Nobody's gone and disinterred the body after all these years, and nobody ever will. So no one knows really the truth. My personal feeling was, because I'm asked my opinion about it, my personal feeling is, I don't care. It didn't matter to me whether, because people use a sign like that as, to indicate what an advanced soul he was, and, he must have been a divine incarnation because his body didn't deteriorate. I don't need that. If his teachings have value, in your life, it doesn't matter whether his body deteriorated after death like everybody else's body or had some special qualities. What's the difference? The teachings are either real and valuable or they're not. There are teachers who had real valuable teachings whose behavior was despicable in many ways, but yet they still are able to teach and help people. And so Yogananda didn't have to be some perfect being or some divine incarnation for his teachings to have value to anybody. So you're welcome to believe his body is impeccable to this day, or just was slow to deteriorate because of its purity. Or you can believe he died, like everybody, like every other incarnated human being. It's up to you. But what really matters is the teaching.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sitting at the lake, and I'm by the windmill right there where you can go down by the water. And I heard, don't focus on my self-realization, focus on your own.
There you go.
And because many are doing that, they're focusing on his self-realization and they're forgetting to have their own.
But they made the same, Christians made the same mistake about Jesus. So, human beings are prone in that way. But, Yogananda would have been the first person to say exactly what you did, but people will do it anyway.
Yeah, I kind of was shown that. I wonder if the co-founder, Bill Wilson of AA, who was very spiritual seeker, I wonder if he looked into the teachings of Yogananda. He had to.
I don't know. I do know that he had exposure to other swamis here and there, and other Eastern teachings, but I don't know to what extent he knew about Yogananda or any of that.
Do you have any other quick stories of anyone, like maybe one of that where Yogananda appeared to them?
I've heard stories like that. They're all different.
Mm.
And, that people heard his voice, people saw his image, people had dreams. So there are different varieties of that kind of, what you might say, visitation or something. You can make of them what you will. You could say they're fantasies. You could say they're real. But the question I have is, how did it change your life?
Yeah.
And did it change your life for the better? Fine. That's great. You're blessed. Maybe Yogananda did speak to you. Maybe you just imagined it. But if the message changed your life for the better, bless you.
Yeah, I heard a lady talk about, she was just on a big podcast, and she was sex trafficked from an early age, a young little girl. She had a near-death experience, and she talks about Yogananda coming to her during her near-death experience. Wow.
If it's the same person.
It has to be. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't doubt those experiences anymore because of my own. But without that experience, I'd probably be a doubter. So, yeah. So
worse.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate your time and your insights and your work. So thanks for coming on. And I'm going to end it with the Yogananda quote, if you don't mind.
Please do. And thank you for having me, Boo Boo. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, what an honor. And it's from Man's Eternal Quest by Yogananda. He says, ignorance is like a great poison in the system. Because of it, we don't realize our true nature, made in the image of God. Such a beautiful person. And thanks for helping elaborate on that. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Just know we out here. Know we out here working in a major way. Had to speak on it just to make a play. Any given subject, know we make a way. Time to level up on the day-to-day. Know we out here working for the greater good. Expand your mind, broaden your lens the way you should. From the stars to the galaxy to speak on spirituality. Higher understanding for the neighborhood.